Tech for Africa.
Good evening, Africa, and welcome to another episode of Wivo Legal Tech for Africa. Picture this. Our personal lives, the clicks, searches, and conversation we think are private have quietly become the most valuable raw material in the world. A new empire has risen, built not on land or oil, but on the trade of our very identities. This is the age of surveillance capitalism, where corporations harvest our behavior, predict our choices, and profit from our lives in ways we barely notice. But what does this mean for Africa, a continent still building its digital frameworks, still negotiating its sovereignty in the global data economy? Are we destined to repeat the mistakes of others? Or even if we chart a different cause, one that protects our people while unlocking innovation? Tonight, we are joined by someone who has spent years studying these very questions. Judith Rauhofer, Senior Lecturer of IT Law at the University of Edinburgh, will help us navigate these distant shorelines and bring the lessons home to Africa's future. Good evening, or good afternoon, Judith, and welcome to Wivo Legal Tech for Africa.
Good evening, Maureen, and thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to the show, and stay with us. This conversation could shape how we think about our digital freedom. So let's start the ball kicking, Judith. Let's start with the big picture. Surveillance capitalism, sounds like a heavy term. How would you explain it in simple terms, and why should Africans care about it today?
Okay, so surveillance capitalism is a term that was actually coined by an American researcher called Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book about it of this title a few years ago. And what it actually means is the way in which online services, online platforms generate revenue, not by charging you a fee for using their services, but by collecting personal data about you, which they then use to create profiles about you, about your likes, your dislikes, the things that you are interested in, all of these things. And those profiles are then used to target advertising at you. So the way in which these the data is collected varies quite a lot. Obviously, if you buy something from a shop like Amazon, for instance, you would give them a certain amount of personal data because they would have to send you something. But even if you're only using an online social media network, for instance, the data that they collect is essentially about everything that you do on that particular platform, on that website. But because they use something called cookies, or these days also some other sort of tracking devices, they will be able to collect an awful lot more data about you. So they will, for instance, know what other websites you have visited, what you have done on those websites. So over time, as you use the internet and as you are a customer, essentially, or a user of a number of online services, those online services will acquire a really rather large arsenal of information about you. I always tend to say that, they know me better than my mother does. And from that, really, what we are starting to create is a sort of an information imbalance. So they will use this information to generate revenue. But on the other hand, this also means, or that is also the reason why you can use these services for free. So it's a trade-off. It's sort of a tripartite trade between three parties, between the platform, between you and the advertisers. You use the platform, the advertiser pays the platform, and the advertiser gets to advertise to you. And that is what we're now calling surveillance capitalism.
Perfect. Why should we as Africans, there is some differences when it comes to culture and the way we do things with Europeans or people from elsewhere. But for Africans in particular, why should we be worried about this model?
Well, I mean, we should all be worried about the model, but I think Africans in particular, I think there are two sort of real issues behind this that I would probably, as a white non-African person, would highlight. One of them is that the system itself is an extractivist, exploitative system. So it is, to a certain extent, a form of colonialism, and in a way, a form of colonialism that applies almost across the world. But it is a structure that, Africans know very, very well in this context. And it is ultimately giving up something, to people who ultimately benefit from it and who generate sort of value from it, that do not necessarily put the same value back into, the countries, the economies, and so on. The other reason really is that there is very little protection available. And I think, there are generally two means of protecting yourself from the surveillance capitalism. One of them is technological. So if, you have a really good technological setup, very good privacy settings, and so on and so on. But that requires the sort of access to that technology, and also it requires knowledge about how to use it and all of this sort of stuff. But more importantly, probably, is the legal framework. So the problem, for a region like Africa is that, of course, it is still very fragmented. It's a lot of different countries. Those countries have different rules, different laws, different levels of laws in terms of privacy protection. And that is, I suppose, where a region like Africa, a continent like Africa differs from, let's say, the European Union, which has very advanced legal frameworks and where sort of technological means of protection are backed up by legal means of protection. So I think this is one of the reasons why this particular new form of colonialism, of digital colonialism, probably will affect Africa and other, majority population countries more than people in the global north.
Thank you. I mean, the global south has always been on the receiving end. But one thing that is clear from what you've said is the lack of reciprocal benefits from this model. It's like just one side profiting from us. What can you say as an expert in this field about how the continent of Africa, or the global south in general, can actually benefit from this sort of model?
I mean, there are a number of different ways to think about it, of course, and different people have sort of different priorities, I think. But the clearest way of benefit, as I said before, is access to online services. So I suppose there is a benefit to individuals in particular. There is a benefit also on the commercial level. Facebook is, on the one hand, for instance, a social network, but a lot of small businesses sell via Facebook. So there is a benefit in there. The problem is that this benefit is then very, very quickly leads to a dependency. And I think therein might lie the problem. And this is me now, I moved to a very small Scottish village recently where I really try to integrate myself into the local community, but I don't have a Facebook account. So it was almost impossible for me to find out what was going on. It was impossible for me to find out what businesses did and what I could do. So it really, creates a dependency on these platforms, even though the platforms provide an opportunity for commerce, for, accessing new customers, for creating community and all of this. But it is a two-edged sword, I think. So that is one of the very big problems, I think. But the real issue, I suppose, is that what we have seen in the global north in this context, even in Europe, that has pretty good protections and has is an economic force of its own account, is that we are now very much seeing the accumulation, the monopolization of the internet. And I think this is also something that even the Europeans really can't get a way out of that, if even we are now dependent on a very, very small number of big platforms, big international big tech businesses, then I think a region like Africa probably has even less chance of escaping that, because there is so much less power on the other side than I would say the European Union at this point in time has. So I think these are the risks in this context, that there are benefits undoubtedly, and there are also benefits for development, for commercial development, and all of these kinds of things. But they do come at a cost, and they come at a cost mostly of dependencies on a number of very, very small providers.
Perfect. So now my next question is, you've established this impact. We've seen the impact of surveillance capitalism in Europe and in the US. What lessons or warnings should Africa take from those experiences?
I think one of the warnings, in an ideal world, one of these warnings would be to learn from the mistakes, that Europe and other countries made, and not fall into these dependencies. Try to develop your own systems, try to develop your own platforms, which then at least have the best interest of Africans at heart. The problem, of course, is that in reality, this would require an enormous amount of investment, an enormous amount of finance. So I feel a little bit like I am recommending an ideal scenario that may very well not be possible in practice. But I mean, at least, I suppose, at the very least, one of the things to do is to be aware of those dependencies, because at the moment, in so many areas and in so many respects, and with regard to technology, there is often a rush towards this new thing, because all we see is the benefits. And I think at least to go into this with open eyes and to understand what dependencies are being created and to what extent this is really a form of digital colonialism, I think that would probably be one of the things that Africa could do. The other thing, of course, is, to really think about creating its own legal frameworks and to do what countries can do, what governments can do to protect their citizens. And that is to put in place legal frameworks that protect, privacy rights, for instance, and other things in an online environment.
Judith, looking at Africa's digital landscape, from mobile money to social media, where do you see surveillance capitalism already at play?
Well, I think again, I'm probably not the expert here, but in some areas, I suppose, like social networking, from my experience in African countries, which is very limited, it's very much sort of surrounded by the African South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, and so on. But what I see is almost an Americanization of those kinds of platforms. So the same platforms that we're using in America, that we're using in Europe, are also very popular, like Facebook, for instance. But what could also, of course, be done, Africa also is very leading in some other areas where it could actually, build upon, for instance, the development of mobile money, driven by the circumstance of often having to send money over vast distances without, very good telecommunications connections and so on. This development of mobile money Africa was very leading in this. And I suppose this is one of the things where, again, countries need to think about what can they do and what are the strengths and, and where are protections required in this context. But I think in a very large part, what we do see is an influx, of big tech firms that are really trying to do the same in African countries as they have done in all other countries. It is a very lucrative market. It is a new market. It is, well, not new, but it is, compared to some other global north countries, it is much less developed and still much more up for colonizing, for want of a better word. So from that perspective, I think focusing on one's own strengths, on development of technologies that actually benefit Africa itself is, I think, one of the most important things to do in this context.
When we talk about data protection, for the ordinary man in Africa, when we hear about data protection, it often feels abstract. I can, recall from Nick Caldry and Majay's Data Grab. In chapter 1 of their book, they reference the king from Southern Africa who was averse to the introduction of Telegram, even though the white man painted the technology as a sort of development for his people, but he perceived that this new technology is a way it's a way of surveillance, to look at what I'm doing, to try to capture my kingdom. So how does surveillance capitalism affects everyday lives, say in health, in politics, or even in shopping habits? I mean, what should the ordinary African man be aware of when it comes to protecting his or her data?
Well, I mean, I think with regard to on an individual level, I think one of the things that we are increasingly seeing in the global north is, for instance, dynamic pricing. So on the one hand, it is very interesting, it's very nice to get access to some of these services for free, but the more people know about you, the more they can actually also gauge, for instance, what you would be willing to pay for a particular service. And of course, these days, all of us see a different internet, and that applies to shopping sites as well. So you book a flight probably from where you are now, and you go on the same website as I go, and we would probably be given a different price, because they would basically, try to assess your purchasing power, and they would assess my purchasing power. And by virtue of the fact that I'm in a global north country right now, that I may be doing this from an Apple device, which is classed as really high value, all of these kinds of things, they would then decide how much to charge me in comparison. And now a lot of people say, well, why not? So people who have less money pay less, but ultimately we have a profit motive behind here. So this is really not how this is going to work in the long run. I think we need to be aware of that. The other thing, of course, also is that I do not believe, as you know, I do not believe in the internet and in surveillance capitalism as what Cory Doctorow, the US author, calls mind control, Ray. I do not believe that we can be influenced to do things that we wouldn't normally do. But I do believe that we all suffer from confirmation bias. So if we already believe something, the internet can very much make us believe more of it, and it can distract us and it can deceive us. And this is also something where our headspace needs to be protected. And again, the more somebody knows about me, the more they know where to put the lever, what will be able, what they will have to tell me to make me do a certain thing, feel a certain thing. So that I think is very, very important. And finally, one of the things that we are currently seeing play out in life, probably in the US, is that because of, this has gone on in the global north for quite some time. Facebook was, I think, introduced in Europe in 2007, in the US probably a little earlier than that. And what we have seen is the creation of monopolies. I think we all have to say that, because a lot of these platforms have what we call network effects. They will be more useful the more people are on them. And this means that we are now looking really at 5 big companies with regard to the majority of online services and offerings and platforms. And what we are seeing at the moment is that this also has an economic dimension. These platforms have generated enormous wealth. They're using that wealth to, buy out competitors, to make sure that certain innovations never see the light of day, or that if they do see the light of day, that they are the ones who own them and that they benefit from it. And what we have seen more recently is that, the generation of all that wealth in the hands of a few people is now something that we have to be worried about in a political context, because that is exactly what's going on in the US at the moment. So there are a number of different things to think about, from the very individual, how much am I going to pay for my flight compared to my neighbor, to the, what do I need to know? Do I need to do to protect my autonomy, my ability to think, my ability to make decisions, to the very, very high level of society, where we really have to ask ourselves, do we want very, very few people become so rich that they can ultimately make regulation or, influence politicians to an extent where they can then dictate what kind of regulation is made and not made?
I don't know if you tuned into the inauguration day, in the US inauguration day of Donald Trump. We saw the back of where he was sitting. So big tech companies' CEOs were sitting behind him. Were you worried about that?
I was very worried about that, and I'm more and more worried about that, because I see now in how the Trump administration uses its political power and its economic power, trying to dictate even to the European Union what laws it can enforce against US companies operating in Europe, not operating in the US, but operating in Europe, what laws it can enforce and what it cannot enforce. And what we're seeing, President Trump do now is to combine this threat of tariffs, which is a really big economic sanction against a country, with the demand, of more laissez-faire regulation. Now, Europe is a big bloc, and it is quite powerful economically, and it has a very, very strong human rights framework, and we will see how this plays out. But if you were then to transfer this onto, a continent like Africa, which is, as I said, more fragmented, does not have the same economic power, there is really very little that can be done in this context. If a US president were to say to any African country, in order to continue to do business with us, or in order to continue to do this or that, you have to do this, and you cannot make laws, and you cannot make regulations, and you have to make sure that our companies can go in there and can extract data, extract content, extract everything, without you being able to protect them. So I think that is a really big problem, and I am worried about it. Yes.
Of course, all that you've been saying, we've seen it at the moment. We've seen it comes to play every day. We're living with it. So for countries in Africa where, like you said, the economic bargaining power is not as huge as the European Union, there comes the battle of protecting the fundamental right of people, whereas also wanting to benefit from these platforms. Like in my country, everybody uses TikTok, everybody uses Facebook, and I remember you at the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned that you are not even on Facebook, but because of the way the model has been built, you can't live without it, and that's the reality down here in Africa. We actually cannot live without Facebook. We cannot live without TikTok. You have to be in it. So where do African governments come in? And especially, I'm looking at a continental bloc now, the African Union, or perhaps the regional blocs of the ECOWAS, SADC, and what can they do? To match up this growing trend of tech oligarchy and trampling over the rights of individuals and citizens of their country.
I think you actually, said exactly the right thing. I think the only way in which to do this really is collectively. I don't think that any individual African country, as much as no individual European country, would have been able to resist this. Europe's strength, as far as I can say, does not come solely from the economic power. It comes from the European Union being a collaboration, a collective. And I think that's probably, one way in which Africa would be able to put up a better negotiation position, shall we say. I want to say front, but, it put itself in a better negotiation position. The single market in Europe is interesting, and that gives Europe sort of, power, economic power. It's interesting because it's a big market, and that is a very different sort of animal than having a small market in individual countries in Africa as well. So I think one of the really good things is, economic unions also to go together in African countries. But of course, also in terms of the legal frameworks. One of the things that, that's Europe has been very useful for Europe in terms of resisting American calls for watering down its own laws and stuff, is that we have this Charter of European Fundamental Rights, and that charter is ultimately sort of an umbrella legal framework. We do not actually, it's our constitution, we do not actually have, our governments don't have the right to make law that violates the charter. So even a President Trump who says to us, well, I don't want you to do this. I want you, I want you to make this law. We wouldn't be able to because our courts would pull us down. So I think the African Union has made very, very good starts in this context. There are some very good human rights conventions already. Yeah. There are some conventions with regard to data protection and cybersecurity. Similarly, SADC has model laws and so on. So I think a harmonization of legal frameworks, pulling together in terms of applying these frameworks, of enforcing them, that might be one way of providing some sort of protective wall. I do appreciate that that's quite difficult, but it is one way of at least in theory, trying to come together as a collective so that there are more of you to resist this kind of colonialism, essentially.
I mean, when you were talking about the trajectory we've taken at the moment, I remember the AI Act and how the European Union changes its. I don't know if you remember the Paris meeting with. I don't know if it was the Vice President of the US, J.D. Vance, who came and started lecturing Europeans of overregulation and stuff. So, I mean, the signs are there; they're written boldly on the wall. So, and for us here in Africa, we're still building our frameworks, our data protection frameworks. Over the course of my research, I realized how the deep and how fragmented we are when it comes to our data protection frameworks. So what opportunities exist to do things differently and maybe even better than Europe or the US?
I mean, I think one of the things that I've realized as I was doing work in Africa in terms of data protection was that just an adoption of the EU style framework, which is generally, sort of pronounced as being the gold standard in the world, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Just an adoption of that is maybe not possible, because it really is a complex framework that the EU really developed on the back of another framework that was in place for 20 years. So to go essentially from zero to this very highly developed framework is a really, really big ask, because it requires a lot from businesses, from data controllers, and it requires a lot of expertise. It requires a lot of people who really know how to do this and how to apply it, and that would be difficult. But also, the question, of course, is whether it is culturally a good fit, because it was a framework that was, developed very much and has a history in the European tradition, in the European background, and in European history in particular. I mean, that is really the main thing. The first data protection laws were discussed in the 1970s in Europe, and that was largely in response to the development of computing power, and databases and all of this. But the reason why that was a concern at the time, this greater availability of data, this greater ability to store data, to share data, the reason why that was a concern was because Europe, Germany, my country in particular, had very hard experiences of surveillance and what this means, and the information imbalance between the government and citizens, and there was a willingness to protect citizens from that ever happening again. So this is a very, very specific tradition, very specific history, and that still infuses in many ways what even the GDPR does today. Now, I'm not saying that all doesn't also apply to other countries. I think what happened, in Europe in the 1930s is absolutely capable of happening in other countries. I mean, again, we might want to look at the US at the moment and think, I feel very much like there are things that are repeating themselves. But I think there is also a cultural difference. Yes. And I think this is something that Africa really needs to look at, to what extent is this cultural difference actually different enough that, the protection of privacy has maybe a different meaning for cultural, for African communities. You said before, it's very different here. And what I always found, for instance, was that there is not very much privacy in family environments.
Yeah.
That actually is frowned upon. So an idea of privacy that is as individualized as it is in Europe traditionally, it maybe doesn't work for Africa. But if that is true, what does work? Okay, what do we have to protect really? Is it a more collective kind of privacy, a group privacy? Is it what is it? And I think this is the question that I can't answer because I come from a very different cultural environment. I think the best thing I can do is just to understand and to acknowledge that whatever I have encountered was very different understanding.
Yeah, I mean, in our last episode, we had Frank Sekemwa, the human rights lawyer from Uganda, who happened to be amongst a group of activists that brought Google to court in Uganda and had a decision. In our discussion, he pointed something out that I have never looked at it in that angle. To my mind, is that there was some stark difference between us and Europeans when it comes to the idea of privacy. And because we had more of a communal thing, a community thing here, I mean, with the Ubuntu, the Ewa, and other philosophies that pride utilitarianism. Well, he said the African is more private than the European. I said, how? Yeah, that's what he said to me. He said, because the African doesn't want the world to know his dirty linens. I mean, for example, he pointed out to the fact that when we had the exposure of some indecent imagery of yourself, that would be a taboo for you in the community. And you want to keep that hidden. You don't want that to go out. And when he pointed that out to me, I realized, yes, there might be some similarities between us. Even though we have a community, everybody's looking out for each other. He said the idea of community is to look out for the welfare of each other, but not to infringe the privacy of each other. We also want our private life to be private and not to be in the hands of the community. So I was like, oh yes, that sounds interesting. And maybe, that might be something we can draw from the Europeans. But like you said, yeah, our cultures are different. Our way of life is different. What we see is right might not be, right from the European angle. So in summary of what you've said, Judith, is that this model encourages digital colonialism, and which has to do with exploitative data acquisition, lack of reciprocal benefits, threat to rights, which is the fundamental thing, and most importantly, according to you, which I want us to come to talk about now, is the hindrance to growth. I mean, the growth of local platforms, or the growth of Africans platform to be at the level of this platform. But one thing you've established in the beginning of this conversation is that not only African are at prey, even Europeans are at prey, because you mentioned the acquisition of innovations and other technologies like WhatsApp. WhatsApp was acquired by Facebook, So how do we balance this, to your mind?
I mean, I think, one of the biggest lessons to learn is, I think, from the things we did wrong, is to look at competition law. So, not just privacy law really, but competition law, and to really use it to do the job that it was meant to do from the very beginning. I mean, this is one of the things. I am a protection lawyer by trade, but I have developed an increasing interest in competition law and antitrust and all of this, because one of the very long-standing issues over the last 40 years probably has been that, again, coming from the US, from the Chicago School, there was this idea that as long as a monopoly building tendency didn't affect the prices that consumers paid at the till, we didn't have to worry about it. And I think what we are now seeing is that we do have to worry about it, because it creates power and takes power away at other ends. So competition law, had we applied this a little bit more strenuously, a little bit earlier, we probably wouldn't be in the situation that we're finding ourselves in now. And I think, again, from an African perspective, the easiest trajectory that I can see, if big tech does the same there as it has done everywhere else, is that it is going to look at any kind of innovation that comes out of Africa, and that it will invest in it. It will do so, appearing benevolent. It will essentially say that we are supporting the development of technology in Africa. We're supporting the skill building of African technologists, and so on and so on. But ultimately, it will do two things. It will either secure those technologies for its own portfolio, or it will make sure that those technologies do not become a threat to them.
Yes.
So again, from the perspective of a lawmaker, of governments and policymakers, and what they would have to look out for is to really say at the very early stage, well, we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. Whether or not the political clout is there, the economic clout is there, is something else. But if we're talking theory, what are the tools in the box that we could use? Competition law is one of those tools that we could use. Privacy, of course, is another, because privacy, or data protection, because as we said in the beginning with surveillance capitalism, data is a raw material. And one of the reasons why it has become so pivotal in this development is that we essentially, all of us, individuals in Europe, we sold it too cheaply. Which means that even European, this strict gold standard European data protection law had loopholes in it. It had gaps in it. And those gaps were very much like the individualized approach to it that allowed us as individual people to sell our data for convenience, for attention, for fun, for all sorts of other things. And again, this is something where potentially lessons can be learned.
Yeah. This leads us to the question of sovereignty by design, which I think you kind of raised abstractly. I would like you to go deep in that, if you can further elaborate how we can achieve sovereignty by design.
Well, I think, again, a lot has to do with what the governments do. I mean, we see this in Europe at the moment. European governments are really struggling right now with the fact that all their government IT systems are provided by US providers.
Yes.
That all their information is stored in US clouds. And in terms of sovereignty, this is, of course, a really big issue when you all of a sudden, that country that you thought of as a friend turns out to be maybe not quite so friendly anymore. And it's not as if we didn't have people to say this out loud, or committees to say this out loud. I think as far back as 2013, there was the Economic and Social Committee that said we should look at data as just another energy, another utility. We need to protect this, and we need to protect our ability to do this in the same way as we try to make sure that we will always have enough energy, that we will always have enough water, that we're not dependent on anybody else to do this. So it's very difficult, I think. And people have maybe taken their eye off the ball a little bit because of this understanding that we were dealing with a friendly partner. But if you really want to make sure that you protect yourself, as a country, then sovereignty ultimately also means that these dependencies at the state level must not exist, really. So, maybe not use Microsoft for every single bit of your state business.
Is there anything we can learn from China? Because we saw a model from China. I mean, during our studies, one of the great reference we always take is from China. I mean, although there's this state-led and stuff, but when it comes to sovereignty by design, China has everything that that is kind of compared to the US. They have their own Google, they have their own Facebook, and I remember meeting the Chinese folks. In one of our courses, I think the one you were teaching, you used to put us in small groups, and that was so great because we have to meet different people, and there were some Chinese people there, and then we had to discuss, and we realized that this is the first time they are using Instagram, because they had their own type of Instagram. So is there something that we can learn there from China?
You can, but I think again you have to also then take note of the fact that that particular medal has two sides. So on the one hand, absolutely, China has protected itself. China is not dependent on anyone, and China is one of the big three empires. China is, if anything, China is going outward and trying to expand its own system and trying to, again, have influence in the world in the same way as the US, albeit that they go about it differently. So yeah, obviously, if you could, any country could put up a golden shield. Any country could say to their citizens, you cannot access the internet outside of China. Any country could have a state-controlled social media platform that everybody needs to use. The question is, of course, one of balance between individual freedom and autonomy and state power. So ultimately, I think when we look at China, they have full sovereignty, but they also have surveillance.
Yeah.
The surveillance is just carried out by somebody else. So really, it's the question from a citizen's perspective really is, what kind of sovereignty do we want that gives us the maximum amount of freedom?
And
I think this is.
Yes,
No,
I just wanted to ask. I mean, the idea of surveillance, which one would, as an expert of data protection, which one would you prefer? Is it surveillance by a tech company? I mean, in Arno Bradford's digital empire, there's the horizontal and vertical lines. Is it the one by the tech company of the American model, or the one by the states of the Chinese model? Which one would you prefer?
I'm a European, neither, of course. I mean, no, listen, it used to be for the longest time, probably until about 2012, 2013 or so, I wasn't too worried about, commercial surveillance. I didn't like it. I was too German to actually really like, or maybe too African in a way. It was a privacy thing for me. I didn't want people to know what websites I looked at and so on. And also I was always spinning in my head, what could they do with that data? What kind of power are they accumulating and stuff? But I wasn't too worried. And at that point in time, I was always like, well, if Tesco knows more about me than my mother, then it's not really my biggest problem in life. I was very, very worried about state surveillance at that point in time. This was before Snowden. I was very worried about all of this. However, I think the problem at the moment is it makes almost no difference anymore.
Yeah.
Because the data gets shared anyway. So really, at the moment, we're in the worst of all worlds. We no longer have to decide between, which particular poison we would prefer, because we already have both poisons in our bloodstream. Commercial data that is collected about us by private companies is made available to governments, and governments share data, or sell government data for development and innovation purposes to commercial entities. So ultimately, as a European, I do like, what Arno Bradford then sees as the third empire, which is the empire of regulation. I want to be protected from both. And that would also then be my advice for Africa. But to have data sovereignty needs also strong guardrails. It needs safeguards.
Yes.
Because data sovereignty in one country by one government, as we do see in China, also then has the potential of that sovereignty being abused for political purposes. So I think what we need is, digital sovereignty within a strong human rights framework that protects citizens also from their own governments and from surveillance that they would be able to, inflict on them.
Yeah, I mean, with in one of my other episodes with Kegeli from Botswana, who is also a data protection lawyer in Botswana, our worry was, even if we had the data sovereignty, and it is, let's say, assume we have the Chinese kind of model, it is in the hands of African leaders. We've seen what they can do. We've seen what they can do with our data in manipulating political decisions, in manipulating elections. Talk less, they have that power now that these companies have. I mean, the one they have power, like for example, in my country, Sierra Leone, the government has power to shut down the internet. And most often they've done that. They've shut down the internet, leaving the people in internet blackout. I mean, imagine now they are in control of these tech companies. They would just wake up one morning and shut down Facebook or whatever sort of communication the people have, which is their fundamental right. So yeah, it is so scary on what lesson we can learn, but like it's like you said, we can look at bits, take bits from each side and take the best side, the best part. As Aristotle would say, the Nicomachean ethics, take the good side, stay at the middle, and which in Arno Bradford's voice is the European model. So now, if you had to leave, I mean, African policymakers, businesses, and young people, especially young people, with one takeaway about the future of data protection, what would it be?
I think what I would say is to not let themselves be blinded by any shiny technology objects. Because I think that is what has happened to us, really. The temptation of these new services, whether that is the old new services of, social media or online shopping or anything like that, or the new services, which is AI, anything that has AI in the title, Gen AI in particular, to always be aware that there is a cost attached to it, to always make sure that they know what the cost is, and also always to make sure that they know they can afford the cost. And I think that might go some way, to at least create an awareness in this context, and then really just be active, be active citizens, be resilient, democracy defending citizens ultimately, and just make sure that you demand from your governments that they protect you. And that, they, both from, external data extraction forces, but also from internal ones, there isn't really that much difference about it. That's what I would say, to be aware and not to follow the shiny object just because it is the next new thing and because, this is what everybody talks about.
Thank you very much. Viewers, if you have any comment or question for our guest today, you can drop it down to the comment section. I forgot to mention that. But so far, so good. We have been in the company of Judith Rauhofer, who is a senior lecturer, lecturer of IT law in the at the University of Edinburgh. If in the absence of no comments, because so far we've got no comment from YouTube and Facebook, and I'm so sorry about the late time change. People are used to the 8 o'clock. Yeah. So in the absence of no comments, Judith, you can. I don't think we should go for a break. You can just give us your last words with regards to surveillance capitalism and why we should be aware as people.
Well, as I said before, I think one of the most important things is we should be aware of power shifts in society. As you know, that is a really big thing for me. I always look at information, the role of information in shifts in power within a society. And my, idea behind this always is that we have three players: the state, industry or commerce, and the individual, and that really in an ideal situation the power between these three entities is in equilibrium. Equilibrium, this is it. So is in equilibrium.
Okay.
And one of the problems of surveillance capitalism is it shifts, it shifts that equilibrium. It shifts power away in most cases from the citizen. Mostly it shifted, or originally it shifted it to the state, and then it started shifting it to commercial entities. So I think the relationship between surveillance capitalism and power is a really, really important one, and we should really always be mindful of the fact that this is happening.
We have a comment from YouTube. It's Liam. Liam is asking, how can we incentivize the development of technologies that are sovereign and independent from the US, legally or otherwise? I mean, aka, why don't we have an EU, Google, Microsoft, Meta equivalent so far? And what needs to change?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, that's a question the Europeans ask themselves as well, or are being asked constantly. I think, as with all of these things, what is the precondition is training. You need people who have the expertise to do this. And the second, of course, is money. You do need investment of these kinds of things. So it's a question of prioritization of budgets. And I suppose that is also one of the problems, that this kind of investment competes with an awful lot of other, budget needs in many African countries. But it is ultimately an economic question that governments will have to ask themselves whether or not this is something that they want to invest in. This is something that is a long-term need of their country, and to what extent they can do that. There is, at the moment, the gap that is created by there not being an awful lot of investment is, of course, that this gap is then filled by big tech, either by providing the services themselves or by providing the investment and thereby, controlling the outcome. I'm sorry that I don't have a better, piece of advice, because this is, again, almost saying, okay, have a different reality than the one we actually have. But one of the first things, of course, is to say, training, qualification, expertise, creating all of that in the African young people, and supporting them in developing these kinds of new technologies. I think that is probably one of the most important things. But I cannot deny that, money plays a role, and that at some stage a decision has to be made where that money will be coming from.
All right, thank you, and thank you again for Liam for asking that question. So I think this is where we'll draw the curtains. Judith, thank you so much for taking time in your very, very busy schedule with the fringe going on, and to joining us here.
Yes.
Yeah, to joining us here this afternoon. So what a fascinating and eye-opening conversation we've had with you, Judith, on surveillance capitalism and what it means, for the future of data protection in Africa. So from distant shorelines, we've learned lessons that are not just warnings, but opportunities for Africa to shape its own digital destiny. So until we meet again next week with another insightful episode, this is where we will draw the curtains and sign out and say bye-bye. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until we meet again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Bye.